Hi there, this is Chris Seeman, and this is the first episode of Entire Bible. This episode was first delivered live on Tuesday, February 3rd, 2026, at Merging Hearts Spiritual Center in Ohio. We did not have the live stream up and running at that time, and so it was not recorded, so I've decided to go ahead and do a Zoom recording using a screen share with my handout. But in future episodes, we'll be doing it live. So we decided we were going to begin at the beginning. We're going to decide to begin with the Torah, right? That's the foundational texts for both the Jewish and Christian Bibles. The first book of the Torah is the book of Bereshit, or Genesis, as it's called in the Greek. And the book of Genesis begins with a creation story. Indeed, it begins with two creation stories. And so last week we talked about this first creation story, basically chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, verse 3. And this week, later tonight, live, we'll be talking about the second creation story. Before I jump into this, I wanted to make a comment about the translation I am using. So since I'm not assuming anyone reads Hebrew, we're reading it in English, and there are thousands of translations of the Bible. Um, the one I'm using is a modified version of the most recent translation of the book of Genesis, or at least the first 11 chapters by Ronald Hendel for the Yale Anchor Bible Commentary series. This was produced in 2024, so it's super contemporary, as in it reflects the most recent knowledge that we have about manuscripts and so forth. It's, the Yale Anchor Bible Commentary is sort of the industrial strength commentary that scholars use. So my point is, in using that, first of all, is to acknowledge where I'm getting the main part of my translation. I will be modifying it in places in order to draw attention to some particular nuance, or because I want to convey it in a different way. Um, but we can talk about the Hebrew anytime you like. But I'm using this because, again, it's up to date, it's scholarly, and if you want to dive deeper into what we're talking about, it's a wonderful resource. Okay, so anyway, that's just acknowledgement that I didn't translate this myself. I'm using a translation. Let's do a screen share now. Okay, so as I said, the book of Genesis begins with two creation stories. The first creation story is found in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. By the way, the chapter and verse divisions, these are much later. They are basically medieval in origin. When Christian monks wanted to use the Bible for their devotions and their worship, they needed to give it a numbering system to help figure out where they were looking for something. But we use it because it's convenient. Okay, so what is a creation story? A creation story, here's the definition I'm giving, it's a narrative that describes reality in terms of its source. And when I say describes reality, I mean it describes the nature and significance of what exists. In terms of its source, because you could describe reality in terms of present experience, or you could describe reality in terms of what you think is the ultimate meaning and purpose of things, looking into some sort of future consummation. We call that eschatology in theology. But to talk about creation means to talk about the origin of things, with the understanding that the nature of thing is at least in part defined by its origin. Obviously, in the Bible, that origin is God. And this is signified in the Bible by applying a very specific verb to God's creative activity, the verb bara. This verb is only used with regard to God. So whatever it means, it's something that is distinctive to this concept of origins. So in addition to describing reality, creation stories also evaluate it. The first creation story has a constant refrain saying that what comes into being is good. So it's a value judgment. It's not just a neutral description. And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, although this will become apparent later on in our series, creation stories generate the possibility of human beings accessing or participating in that goodness, in that source. Um, we'll see what that means. In the case of the first creation story, it has to do with time. Uh, if you're familiar with this story, it talks about um, the coming to being of the universe in a sequence of days, with the seventh day being the culmination of this process. And this seventh day is in Judaism called the Shabbat. It is the day when Jews participate and renew their connection with their source, as it were. Uh, the Sabbath is Friday evening to Saturday evening. It is not the same as the Christian Lord's Day, which is Sunday. But in any case, that's what a creation story does. It describes reality, it evaluates it, and it creates a point of access for human beings in the present to somehow connect back with that source. Okay, with that general description in mind, let's walk through this verse by verse. So, the first verse of this creation story, the first line, is not a complete sentence. Uh, when the Bible was translated into Greek, round about the 3rd or 2nd century BC, the grammar of this sentence was changed, or of this clause was changed, so that it became a complete sentence. And in the Greek translation, it renders this, in the beginning, comma, God created the heavens and the earth. In fact, though, in the Hebrew, the opening line is a subordinate clause. It describes a temporal context for what's about to happen. So it says, really, when I mean, this is the best you can get into English because it sounds clunky in Hebrew. When God began creating the heavens and the earth, comma, then you get a description of what things were like before God started creating. That seems a bit counterintuitive to people who have been raised with the Greek translation, because the Greek translation seems to say that God created everything out of nothing. That's a doctrine in both Judaism and Christianity, but it is not what is found in this text. In other words, this has a different understanding, or rather a different focus of the idea of creation. So, first of all, when we say God, what do we mean by that? So the word for God in this text is Elohim. This noun is plural in form, but singular in meaning. The singular would be something like Eloah, which, by the way, is in a sister language, the language of Arabic, is where you get the word Allah, which is the Arabic word for God. Okay, but it's a plural in form, but it is a singular in meaning. So we have a singular deity who is engaging in a creative activity. The opening words, what the Greek translates as "in the beginning," are meant to be heard. And much of this text is quasi-poetic. That is to say, it deliberately uses sounds and sequences of sounds in order to create a aesthetic effect. So, for example, the first two words are Bereshit bara. Remember, bara is that word to create. Bereshit literally means in the beginning of God's creating. And notice the repetition of consonants here, ba, ra, and then there's a silent, a silent aleph, we would call it. And that we have that in the first word, and we have it in the following word, bare bara. It's kind of a rhythm, bare bara. In English, we would call that alliteration, right? The words start with the same letter, and also consonants. They have the same sequence of consonants. So this is just to point out that the language of this text is um, uh, deliberately aesthetic. It wants to rhyme. It wants to draw attention to patterns, which is appropriate because this story is about patterns. It's about structure. It's about form. Okay, when it says when God was creating the heavens and the earth, Hashemayim wa et haaretz, the heavens and the earth is what's called a merism. A merism means you're using a part to represent a whole. So if you think of the earth is down here and the heavens or the skies up there, to say God created the heavens and the earth means that he created those things and everything in between. He created everything, in other words. So when God began creating everything, comma, the earth, notice the earth already exists, but it was formless and empty. This is my translation of this, of the Hebrew tohu wavohu. Tohu wavohu, again, notice the rhyming of that. The earth was formless and empty. Um, this is what's called a hendiades, another grammatical term. Uh, Hen is the Greek word for one, dia is the preposition through, and dis is the Greek word for two. So literally one through two, you're communicating one idea through two separate words. So formless and empty means formless emptiness, something like that. But what does tohu avohu mean? Because of course, we need to know what God is creating something out of. So this expression tohu avohu is not a neutral term. It's not like things were just, amorphous, although they were. This is a value judgment. I've given you here two passages from other parts of the Bible that use this expression. And they both have to do with death and destruction. Um, the second one is the most important one. If you read chapter 4 of the book of Jeremiah, which is a poem, it is a poem about a war zone. And in this war zone where there is death and destruction and sorrow and weeping, and it is impossible for life to be here, the poet says, I looked at the earth, it was formless and empty, tohu avohu. I looked at the heavens and their light had gone out. In other words, the cosmos itself is collapsing. And all you need to do is think about any war zone on Earth today. Think of Gaza, think of Ukraine, think of any place where life cannot exist, at least people cannot live well, where there's chaos. That's basically what's being described here. So when God began his process of creating, the earth was chaos. The earth was unlivable. The earth was death. Right? Um, the Greek philosopher Aristotle famously described existence, things that exist as a combination of matter and form. So that's an insight. Matter is sort of the stuff we're made out of, but form is the structure, the form that we take that makes a human being a human, that makes a book, and so forth. So if you will, the first creation story in the Bible describes um, a process by which formless matter becomes formed, takes shape, right? And not just any random shape, but takes a life-sustaining shape. So we go from death to life, basically. But it's a long process. So this is only the first of three descriptors of what things were like, as it were, before the creative process begins. There was formless chaos. We're told there was darkness over the face of Tehom. Here I'm leaving that untranslated. So what is Tehom? Tehom is elsewhere in the Bible, it is a reference to what we might call primordial waters. So in the ancient world, formless chaos was imagined as a massive encircling ocean, a raging ocean, a torrent, where at least if you're a air-breathing creature, you can't live, right? This can be found if you read Psalm 104. where it speaks again. This is a creation story. It says that God fixed the earth on its foundations so that it can never be shaken. Tehom covered it like a garment. So everything was underwater. And if everything's underwater, then air breathing life cannot exist, right? So the other thing about Tehom is that it sounds very much, it is cognate with a another term from a related language, Tiamat, Tehom Tiamat. Tiamat is this monster in the Babylonian creation story whose raging threatens the life of the gods, and so the gods have to fight against Tehom and defeat her. This too is being echoed, as it were. I call this demythologized because unlike in the Babylonian creation story, Tiamat or Tehom is not an active force as it is here in Psalm 104 that God has to subjugate. There's no subjugation involved in this creation story. There's nothing to oppose the creative process. But there is Tehom. There is these primordial waters. There's also darkness, which also appears to be primordial and uncreated. If you want to find another book in the library that takes a different view, take a look at Isaiah chapter 45:7, where God says, I create darkness and light, I create good and evil. That's a much more comprehensive understanding of creation. But in this story, God does not create darkness. And darkness, by the way, is not good. It's part of that chaos. Okay, so we're told the earth was formless and empty. So there was nothing there and it was unlivable. It was dark. It was covered by this primordial ocean. And finally, we are told that a divine spirit or perhaps a divine wind was hovering over the face of the waters. Again, the waters being a reference to Tehom. Notice here in this psalm, it talks about Tehom and the waters, right? So these are not the only, this is not the only creation story in the Bible. There are about 13 of them. Most of them are in the Psalms and in the prophets. And most of them actually involve a battle between God, or a struggle between God and personified or quasi-personified forces of chaos, as we have in Psalm 104. But here, there's nothing of that. So we have this divine wind or spirit, a ruach Elohim. I prefer the term spirit because it anticipates a later passage in the Bible, in the Torah, which will involve this same spirit, and it will be used in order to empower a human being, a guy named Bezalel, to craft a dwelling place for God's spirit, for God's glory on earth. That's a whole nother story. But in other words, this spirit is a creative spirit. It's what enables God in the first case, or this human being in the second case, to create form out of formlessness, to populate things in a sense. And there's another kind of poetic element to this when it says it was hovering. Uh, there's a consonance. There's a use of similar consonants. Ruach marachefet, ha ha. Right? Okay. So that's the description of what was there before God did anything. So finally, we come to the conclusion of the sentence. So if you go back to the beginning, when God began creating, da da da, God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning one day. Okay, so here we have the first act of creation. It has to do with light. But what sort of light is this? It seems to have no created source in the sense that it's not coming from a sun or a nuclear power plant or something like that. It's not coming from a light bulb. It's just there. So we have this notion of light that is almost a kind of spiritual light, perhaps, something that is, more than just the ordinary. Um, and when we're told that God saw it, what does that mean? We can personify God with human characteristics, but what does it mean for God as the source of reality to see something, right? God doesn't have a physical eye. More importantly, God doesn't have a particular point of view, right? When we think of seeing, we think of what's your point of view? If you look at a piece of art from one angle, it'll look different from it if you look at it in the other, right? If you come from one background, you're going to experience food differently from another background. Point of view is part of human nature. But when God sees something, God is not standing in any particular place. God is, in a sense, nowhere in this story. He is not an entity within the cosmos. He is creating the cosmos. So what does it mean for him to see? That's one of the many questions that the Bible doesn't answer, but it forces us to ask and could then lead to a reflection. What does it mean to have a God's eye view of things? And what does it mean to use that God's eye view, if you will, to pronounce a value judgment that the light is good? Good in what sense? Well, not in a moral sense. The light's not morally good or morally bad. Um, Good in what sense? This is one of many questions this story raises. Also, notice that God does not say that the darkness is good. Whatever's primordial is not good. That's why creation takes place. Also, notice that God creates, although God does indeed sort of, snap light into existence by a speech act, um, God creates by separating, right? First, he calls it into being, but then he uses it to separate things. The first part of this creation story is about separation. And then we have God calling things, giving them names, night and day. So notice the names of things follow their separation. Things acquire identity only as a result of being differentiated from other things. Right? Also, this notion of time, right? There was evening and there was morning one day. In this understanding, a day begins at evening because the universe began in darkness and it concludes with light. So every day in this understanding is a recapitulation of the creation, of the activity of divine creation. You begin at evening, you end at morning. Okay, there's other things in my notes that you can take a look at, but let's move on here. Okay, and God said, let there be, and here I leave this untranslated, a rakia in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters. Okay, so what is a rakia? So I have a note on this here. It comes from a verb meaning, or a word meaning beaten out, as in like a metalsmith beating out a hard surface. Um, think of like, beating out a particular metal object, like if you're forging something, um, you turn it into like a bowl. Let's imagine we're talking about a bowl. And in fact, uh, I note here in a cognate language to Hebrew, a ruku, which sounds like rakia, is the word for cauldron, suggesting a semicircular shape. And the expression "the circle of the heavens" is a term that one finds in the Bible. So, in a sense, God creates a dome, a bowl, and turns it upside down, and that's going to become the sky. Um, Notice he says, "Let there be a rakia in the midst of the waters," because there's still waters everywhere. Let it separate the waters. So God makes the rakia, separates the waters beneath it from the waters above it, and that creates a space with air in it, right? And God calls the rakia heavens or skies. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Notice also that uh, when God says, let this thing separate the waters, in the first place, God is the one who separates light and darkness, but now he delegates that role to a created object, this dome, right? Think of a plexiglass dome, like a see-through dome. That's why the sky is blue, because there's water above it, right? That's sort of an ancient view of this. Okay, notice also that the heavens in this story do not become the dwelling place of God. In many biblical texts, God is imaged as being in heaven, like heaven is sort of God's throne from which he surveys the earth. Not so here. This is a very unusual story in that it does not locate God anywhere. God is nowhere. He transcends creation. Um, why is this unlike the light? Why is this not pronounced good? The answer is because the waters have not yet been fully confined. You got waters below, you got waters above, you got air between, but you don't have an earth yet. You don't have a dry land. That has to happen still, and that's what's going to happen next. Okay, so this next part here, God says, let the waters be gathered into one place so that the dry ground may appear. And it was so. And God called the dry ground earth, and the gathering place of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So now we have the goodness. Once waters have been pushed around and confined to certain spaces, so you can have dry land. Again, this is written from the perspective of air-breathing land, terrestrial mammals called us, right? So this is a creation of how the world becomes livable to human beings, right? Um, and notice that the Earth, even though it's referenced earlier on as this kind of, submerged mass, it's not called Earth formally until dry ground appears, right? So again, the name of something differentiates it from something else. Dry ground from submerged ground. Also note in the Hebrew, there is an interesting word play here. The word for waters in the plural is mayim. The word for seas, what God turns the waters into, is yamim. So notice that just as God orders the waters to a particular place that differentiates them from the land, he literally reorders the consonants. MYM becomes YMM. So literally you see in the word itself the reordering of reality into something that is livable, right? Okay, next. God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation. Notice he's delegating something to the earth. Every kind of plant that bears seed and every kind of fruit tree on the earth that bears fruit with its seed in it. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation. We get a repeat of what was brought forth, and God saw that it was good. And then we have a third day. Um, Note that on this third day, there are two acts of creation, the dry ground and the seas on the one hand, and the populating of the dry ground with vegetation. Okay. Next, we're told, God said, let there be luminaries in the rakia of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Okay, so night and day are already separated, but now he's going to delegate that role to what are called luminaries. Sometimes it's just translated lights, but it's actually different. The word for light in Hebrew is or, and this is ma'oroth. So it's obviously related to the idea of light. We capture this by the Latin luminary, from lumen, light. And so we go from having light having no particular location to light being structured through these luminaries. And let these luminaries be signs for festivals, days, and years. And let them be luminaries in the rakia of the heavens to illuminate the earth. And it was so. We're told God made two great luminaries. We would call that the sun and the moon, although interestingly, the sun and the moon are not named here. One to regulate the day, the other to regulate the night, and the stars. The stars are named, but not the sun and moon. God sets them in the rakia to illuminate everything, to regulate everything, to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. Fourth day. Okay, so this emphasis on God creating these luminaries, or rather making these luminaries, there's a different verb here between create and make. They are objects. By emphasizing that they are simply objects made by God, traditional associations with the heavenly bodies and divine beings is suppressed. Right? This is something not only in the surrounding cultures, but also in the Bible. Right? Um, and in most ancient Near Eastern cultures, the stars, especially, but the heavenly bodies in general, were seen to be symbols of the gods. And so the idea was that the heavenly host or the heavenly array uh, were the controlling forces, things that controlled the world. Here, they have no controlling role. They are mere light bulbs, basically. So again, this is a demythologizing of a traditional cosmology while still using the conception of this cosmology. Likewise, the fact that sun and moon are not named probably reflects the fact that sun and moon are divine beings in most ancient Near Eastern cultures. And if you want to suppress this idea of a divinized cosmos, you're going to not name them. The reference to festivals, however, demonstrates an interest in rooting religious observances in creation, which will be something that we'll learn later on. Remember that the purpose of a creation story, among other things, is to enable people to connect with the created order as it was originally formulated. Okay, that was day 4, right? Day 5, God said, "Let the waters teem with teeming living creatures, and on the earth let birds fly on the face of the rakia of the heavens." Okay, so here we have animals, right? And God created the great sea monsters and all kinds of crawling living creatures with which the waters teem, and all kinds of winged birds. God saw that it was good, and he blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." Fifth day. Okay. So again, God delegates this task of bringing things forth to what we might call nature. This reference to the great sea monsters is really interesting. The Hataninim Hagadolim. These are the only individual species of living creature named in this story. They are also the only species that has the object that is the object of the verb create so far. The verb bara was used in verse 1 as a kind of comprehensive term for everything. But up until now, God has simply been making things, not creating things. With the sea monsters, they are actually bara, they are created. Why is this? So in other biblical texts, taninim, that's sea monster or sea serpent, they appear to be primordial, like the darkness and like Tehom. Making them creations of God denies them this status. And I should say that sea monsters, I mean, this is like Godzilla. These are kaiju, right? These are monstrous, disruptive animals, creatures that threaten the order of the cosmos. But by having them created on day 5, they are not no longer primordial. They're not forces that are alien to the divine creator. They are constrained, as it were, right? They are merely animals. So this is a very important point because, as I've said, most creation stories, both in the Bible and out of it, involve conflict. They involve fights between God and some symbol of chaos, right? Usually a sea monster. Um, this is the one story that doesn't. And that itself suggests that what we think of as the forces of death and evil and chaos and all these negative things that make human life difficult or impossible, the basic message of this story is that that is not necessary. That is not primordial. It's not just the way things are, because we have a non-conflictual and as we'll see, non-violent universe in this. And the creation of the sea monsters is one of the ways of communicating that. By creating them, you control them, right? Okay, so it's also interesting that animals are called to be fruitful. Now, we know this is a reference to procreation, obviously, but notice that the meaning of this term is more literally related to plants, right? Be fruitful, right? Plants are fruitful. That when we looked at the creation of the plants, right, over here, um, plants bear seeds and the fruit trees bears fruit with its seed in it. So bearing fruit comes from the domain of vegetable life, but it is now being applied secondarily to animal life. Now this expression has become so common in English that we say, "Oh, yeah, be fruitful means to procreate." Um, but it is interesting because one of the purposes of this story is to categorize things. So it's suggesting that plants and animals have something in common, right? Even if animals do it in a different way than plants do. Okay, let's see now. We come to this is day 6, right? This is part of day 6, uh, where God creates land animals. Let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, domestic animals, crawling things, every kind of wild animal of the earth. And so it was. God made all these animals, and it was good. Okay, notice that unlike sea and sky creatures, the land animals are classified according to their future relationship with humans, namely domestic versus wild, right? Obviously, this now is thinking about creation with respect to the human author who is writing about this. We're imagining how things relate to us. It is interesting, though, that there's no procreative blessing to land animals as there is to the sky animals and the water animals. Um, but as we'll see, this reference to domestication of domestic animals, this may be anticipating what's going to happen next, which is the creation of human beings. Okay, so we have this very famous passage. God said, "Let us make a human in our image, after our likeness, so that they, the humans, may rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the domestic animals, all the wild animals of the earth, and all the creatures that crawl on the earth." And God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. God blesses them and says to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all the things that crawl on the earth." Okay, we need to pause here because there's a lot of peculiarities about this. In other words, we've seen a rhythm, a pattern that this story has created, and this breaks the pattern. First of all, notice that although God creates in the singular, here as elsewhere, he proposes the creation of humanity in the plural. Let us make. Whatever that means, and we'll go into the probable meaning of that, it indicates that this is a different kind of creative act than everything that's preceded it. In the past, God says, "Let there be," in this sort of impersonal, distant way. But now he says, "Let us make." So not only is there a different kind of personal investment in the creation of the human, but also there is a kind of deliberation. God is, usually he deliberates or he evaluates after he creates, but now he's deliberating as he's thinking about it, right? And then, of course, we have this very famous question: what is this likeness and image that human beings represent? But let's go step by step. So, who is the we here? There are two other passages in the book of Genesis where God speaks in this idiom. They both come from the other creation story and its accompanying narratives, but it's the same thing, where God says in chapter 3, "See, the man has become like one of us." So we have this plural that God refers to. Or, "Come, let us go down," and confuse their language. So there is something about a plurality here that we haven't seen before. Very likely, God is addressing a divine council, a group of other divine beings. Um, they are unnamed, they are uncategorized, they are undefined. Um, uh, here are some passages from other parts of the Bible where you have the reference to the divine council. The idea of a divine council, though, is basically it's a deliberative body, and it is presided over by a king, right? So in this conceptuality, God, Elohim, is the leader of the divine council. Up until now, though, he's been acting on his own, but now he deliberates with them. This is not unlike the way monarchs talk. The British monarchy could say, we are pleased with this, right? This kind of royal we, if you were. But that's very likely what it is. What is more interesting, though, is the fact that these other divine beings are not visible, right? They are not mentioned other than this reference point here. And that could be part of this general sense of trying to demythologize the world, right? That everything sort of the creative divine is all sort of encompassed in this one divine reality called Elohim. But nevertheless, you have this aside to these other divine beings. Okay, what does it mean, image and likeness? Are these the same thing or different things? Well, we find them used individually in different passages later on. Um, But what we don't get any initial explicit clues as to what it means, but obviously it marks human beings as different, right? No other, in this account, no other reality, no other entity within reality images God. Plants don't do it, rocks don't do it, the sea doesn't do it, the heavens don't do it, only humans do it. Why is that? Well, notice that the first articulation of this here is followed by a purpose clause, so that. So let us do this so that. Is it possible then that the whatever image and likeness mean, you need something in your image and likeness in order to do what you want them to do? What does God want them to do? Well, he wants them to rule. He wants them to rule animals. And later on, when he gives them this blessing, he wants them to subdue the earth. Notice that other animals fill the earth. Only human beings can subdue it. Other animals teem throughout the world, right, as it says in the day 5, but only human beings can rule them. But what does this mean to subdue the earth to rule animals? So all these mysteries here, um, we will take a look at this in a moment here. In this next verse, we get at least a negative answer for this about what it doesn't mean. Um, God also said, so this is still part of the same speech. See, I, God, give you, humans, every seed bearing plant on all the earth, every tree that has seed bearing fruit on it, to be your food. So be vegan. And to all the wild animals and all the birds of the air and all the living creatures that crawl upon the earth, I give all the green plants for food. And so it was. God saw that all he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and morning, a sixth day. Okay, here's where we should put the brakes on. Okay, so far we've seen that this is a quasi-poetic way of describing reality as we know it, right? Sky, earth, sea, animals, plants, people, right? Everything is as it is. But here we have something that is completely contrafactual. We have a non-violent ecosystem, a vegan, herbivorous, vegetarian ecosystem. Even animals have to eat plants. I mean, some animals do, but it's too bad for the carnivores, right? This is a non-violent universe. It is totally counter to reality as we know it. And this is one function of a creation story. It is to describe the world not as it is, but as it should be. In this sense, it is a utopia. Utopias are alternative realities, which might be far away in time or space. Here it's far away in the past, but the function of a utopia is to critique the way things are. So for God to say, I want everyone and everything to eat plants rather than one another, and he says it was very good. Here's a very important value statement. He's saying that violence is bad and non-violence is good. Um, It also, by the way, helps clarify that when he says your human being's role is to rule animals, it doesn't mean eating them. So whatever else it might mean, it implies limitation. People can't do whatever they want with animals. That's not what ruling means. Um, this whole connection between nonviolence and goodness, this is confirmed in Genesis chapter 6, verse 12, which we'll look at later in this series, where it says, God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupted by violence. Notice the exact same phraseology here. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. These are the only two places in Genesis where that idiom, and behold, it was, can be found. So, literally, this creation story is a commentary on violence. And so now notice how we move from goodness, whatever that means, as a quality of the way things should be. That would then lead to a kind of ethics, a kind of moral principle. So if nonviolence is good, and if goodness is what describes creation as a whole, as we might say, as an ecosystem, right? If the ecosystem is very good, being nonviolent, then whatever violates that ecosystem, right? Not just what we might think of as nature, but one another, for example, when we harm other people, whatever violates the way things should be is the definition of what evil is. So this is another thing that creation stories can do. They can establish a conceptual foundation for why something is good, why something is bad. Creation stories are value judgments, right? Okay, then we have this kind of concluding statement. Thus, the heavens and the earth and all their array were completed. So this kind of is a callback to Genesis 1. When God began creating the heavens and the earth, now we're told the heavens and the earth and all their array, all their form, and all their content were completed. Then we have the concluding statement. On the seventh day, God completed the work he had been doing. He rested on the seventh day from all the work he had undertaken. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on the seventh day, God rested from all the work he had done in creation. Okay, very important conclusion here. Unlike other creation stories where the creator rests from battle waged against the forces of chaos, here the creator encountered no opposition. In other words, this rest is not recuperative, but contemplative. This is very important. So God doesn't rest because, oh, it's so tiring, this work. No, he rests because he is contemplating, right? Uh, Creation is very good, we're told in the previous couple verses back, but it is not holy. The opposite of holy is very good. Holy is a descriptor for this particular time of contemplation. Notice that there is no holy place in this cosmos as conceptualized here. There's only a holy time. And that means that whenever that time comes, human beings, now looking forward in time, human beings are able to connect with that contemplative reality of being very good, right? So we have this tradition in Judaism, especially, of resting on the seventh day, on the Shabbat, which literally means ceasing. uh, Resting not because you're tired, but because you are pausing to contemplate the goodness of the way things should be. And that is essentially a way of saying that what is created in this story is not simply nature, but also the capacity for a spiritual dimension to reality, a spiritual experience of reality. Right? Okay, so that is the summary. Here is a visual that maybe now we can look back at this story. Notice that it took 6 days for God to create things, right? Why 6 days? Well, notice that there's 3 and 3 here, and they kind of parallel each other. The first 3 days, God creates by separating things. He separates light from darkness. He separates the waters from the waters, creating air. He separates the waters from the dry ground, creating the earth. God does not create out of nothing in this story. He creates by forming formlessness and thereby giving names and identities to things. And the form that he creates is a life-giving ecosystem. The life part is the second 3 days. God fills this structured reality with things that move, right? Things that move in the sky, the luminaries, things that move in the water and the sky and the earth, including us. So we have, remember, that, and this explains why it says, when God began creating, the earth was formless and empty. Notice that each half of the creation process addresses each half of that problem. Formlessness and emptiness become form and filled with life, right? And then at the conclusion, you have rest and sacred time, which is to contemplate the goodness of that nonviolent universe. So there we have creation story number 1. This today, later on today, we'll be doing a live stream of creation story number 2. Hope you'll be there. Take care.